Good evening. My name is Peter McEvoy. We'll just give it 30 more seconds as people are entering the Zoom room, so to speak, before we kick off. Okay, so there's still a steady stream of people, but I'm conscious of time, and I'm also conscious I'll probably overrun my allotted talking time, so we'll kick off and see how we go. Okay, so just a bit of a welcome and housekeeping. The plan is 30 minutes talk and 30 minutes for Q&A. I suspect we'll go slightly over on the talk and we'll make our time back on the question and answer. The talk is being recorded. It's already being recorded. Most of you are off screen and muted anyway, so you'll not be identified, but if there's any issue, do let us know in the text box. You're all automatically muted, and we would ask that we'll use the chat facility either through Zoom, or we have another fun little poll function I'll show you in a second. And thank you to Nina Schoenberg, who's on the call, who is also Ulster Wildlife and is keeping an eye on the waiting room and any tech problems, which will hopefully not materialize in the background. So just we'll do 3 polls through this talk. I haven't used this before as a presenter, but I've had great fun on the other end. So basically what I'm asking you to do is use your smartphone and go to slido.com and type in that number. You'll get another opportunity in a second if you miss the number. And at the appropriate times, when you go to that page, the questions on the screen will appear on your phone, and as you respond, they'll come up live on the screen, and it will give us a bit of insight as to who people are and what we're all thinking. So just if you want to navigate to that now on your phone, assuming you're sitting on a laptop or a computer, it's the best way to do it. Have that in your hand and answer the questions using it. And any queries, just stick them in the chat box and Nina will help you, hopefully. So what we're going to talk about, quick introduction about me and about you lot, hopefully. And then we're going to talk about wildlife trusts, the Ulster Wildlife Trust, but also the general wildlife trusts policies and thoughts about where we want to be, 30 by 30 nature recovery networks. I want to talk about agriculture policy, where we've come to and where we're going to, because this is really important in the context of nature on farmland. I'm going to spend a good bit of time on agri-environment schemes and talk about our EFS group program, which is something that I oversee and is a huge part of Ulster Wildlife's work with farmers. And then a very quick chat about farming and carbon, because it's a complicated issue, it's a very current issue, and it ties in immensely with farmland biodiversity. And then hopefully, if we get through this quick enough, a quick case study that ties all this together using the marsh fritillary butterfly here, which is a rare, protected and iconic species, which certain parts of Northern Ireland are stronghold. And then some time for Q&A. So very quickly about me, I don't really want to talk about me, but the context is important for the talk. I'm an ecologist. I started my career working on priority habitats, priority species, all across Northern Ireland and then Republic of Ireland. And you meet farmers on the way because most of these species are on farmland. I then moved to the Isle of Man in 2008 to be their biodiversity officer and designate sites and ended up starting their single farm payment system as well, the cross compliance side. So again, working with farmers, and that's me teaching farmers how to identify grasses. Now, for my sins, I stopped being a biodiversity officer and ended up being agriculture policy officer and then director of agriculture. So I was involved with a flour mill, an abattoir, a creamery, and looking at the whole kind of life cycle of farming and the sustainability of it as an industry and the impacts on biodiversity. So I've seen the full picture, and now I'm back at Ulster Wildlife, and it's fantastic because I still get to put my boots on and be an ecologist, but I also get to look at policy and understand what makes things tick and have a better understanding of what a sustainable landscape will be. And that's me talking to Edwin Poots, the Dairy Minister, about peat depths and the importance of good quality peatlands to store and sequester carbon. So I'm going to come to this slide twice more. This is really important. This is really what the whole talk hinges upon. We're all here because we're supporters of Ulster wildlife and we're interested in nature. And we're here to learn about nature and farming. But there's an intrinsic link between obviously food production, farming itself in terms of the rural communities and the people who do it and how that is sustainable. And all these things tie together in a thing called food security. So that's about how sustainable the landscape is to produce food in the future, how healthy our ecosystems are to deliver it, water, carbon, pollinators, you name it. And any one of these three can get out of balance, and clearly they have done and will continue to flux as to which is the most important. So firstly, I'm going to try this with any luck at work. I'm going to ask you a little poll, because if you look at that picture on the right, that is a land classification map of Northern Ireland. There are 23 land classes ranging from lowland, lovely rolling green fields for dairy, right through to the top of mountains. And it's a very diverse landscape in Northern Ireland. And I suspect a lot of our attendees tonight are from the East and are not farmers. And I'm kind of hoping that's the case because that's the pitch, but I'm curious to know where you are and what you know about farming or what your relationship is. So if you go to Slido now, hopefully this is working. And to trick the system here, I've given people multiple choice. So obviously, please only come from one county or one place. But there's two questions at the end, farmer and non-farmer. So if you can also answer that one if it permits, and let's see where everybody's from. It's interesting. I realized I should have put Belfast area as a separate option, but I'll let you split between Antrim and Tye. So I'm amazed that actually that Fermanagh is coming up there. I'm not surprised we're mostly non-farmers in our demographic. That's entirely expected. Okay, that's great. I take that as a good enough straw poll. So we're mostly non-farmers, as I anticipated, but what I'm surprised that, oh, there's Down making a move. So we probably have a good East Coast Belfast centric audience, as well as a good spread across Northern Ireland and some from the Republic as well, which is great. Still votes coming in. I'm going to move on anyway. That's a good spread, good diverse spread, but clearly lots of non-farmers. So that's, thank you very much. That works. 2 more of these to come later. So quick snapshot about farming in Northern Ireland before we talk about the biodiversity, if you like. It's really important is the summary. And there's some really key figures. If you round them, they're the kind of figures you can keep in your back pocket and pull out anytime because they're easy to remember. So there's roughly 1 million hectares, or 75% of the land in Northern Ireland is farmed. There are 50,000 farm workers and 100,000 in total if you count the whole food industry, which equates to almost 25% of all jobs in Northern Ireland. So this is very important from our economic prosperity point of view and for our rural economy. There are 25,000 farms. Each farm is small by UK standards. It's 40 hectares or 100 acres, but significant enough, in a landscape scale, if you get a few farmers working together, that you can protect species and habitats across the landscape. So I want to talk a couple of slides about wildlife trusts and what we do and why farming is important to set some context. So there's a 30 by 30 vision that the wildlife trusts have, where we are calling on at least 30% of our land and sea to be connected and protected for nature's recovery by 2030. And that's about making space for nature in all aspects of land and sea. So, there's a nice graphic on the right here that shows hedgerows increasing, more trees, peatland restored. These are the kind of things we're talking about. This is what we want. They're all on farmland. We can't do this without farmers. Ulster Wildlife has 19 nature reserves that we own or manage. And that's a very important part of what we do. But we're not going to achieve 30 by 30 with 19, some very small nature reserves. But I'll talk to you in a little while about our EFS program, where we have over 400 farmer members. And this is pin map of most of them, not all, that we currently work with. And you'll see, we're definitely clustered in certain areas, and I'll explain that at some point, but we're doing a great job across a landscape. So working with farmers is a really important way of achieving our objectives. And then I'm going to talk about Nature Recovery Networks. Nina, who's on the call, is our Nature Recovery Network officer. So she'll probably scold me for getting something wrong, but at least she'll be chuffed that we've covered it. The way I think of it, it's probably less so about our own landscape, but an easier concept is if you imagine some orangutans in a jungle and it's being cleared for palm oil, and it's getting fragmented, and the little bits of important rainforest are getting smaller and smaller, and they're harder to move across, like that picture in the top left. We're trying to join those up again. And the bottom right is, you imagine a European or an American highway that's cutting a habitat in two, and things can't move across, and there's a barrier there. But you can build bridges, you can create connections. That's the principle of it. And there's a couple of oft used slides as a template. So this is one. So if you imagine you've got a core nice piece of woodland, and you've got some hedges coming out of it, which connects it to another bit of woodland. You want to plant a piece of woodland, you want to connect it up with the hedgerow. You've got all these scattered little bits that aren't connected to anything, they're of less value. So we want to connect those up. Think of this in a farmed landscape. So this is a mocked up example. So you've got these core areas in green. So say it's, in this case, say raised bogs, peat bogs, and the associated habitats are degraded bits of grassland on the edges of them. And these are getting nibbled by farming or drained things. So what we want to do is start buffering them, start fixing the bad bits, making sure the habitats around them are fixed or planted with trees, or the drains are blocked, whatever it is. And all of a sudden start joining it up and making it more whole again. So back to that analogy of orangutans in the jungle that can't move about. Only we'll be talking about butterflies, for example, later on. It's exactly the same principle. So we were looking at a landscape scale across farmland to join it up to make it healthy and good for habitats and species. So in terms of agriculture policy, before I talk about this, I want to know what you think about farming and who makes farmers do what they do. So again, we're back onto Slido, and what we're asking is, who makes farmers do what they do? Is it us as a consumer? Is it the farmer himself? Is it Northern Ireland policymakers? EU or UK? Now, obviously, till recently, or even still, you could argue it's EU policy. We're now out of the EU after Brexit, but still adhering to most of those rules, and post-Brexit policy is only developing. Is it global geopolitics? War, famine, migration? Is it commodity prices? Is it the price of milk or wheat? We talk about Ukraine being the breadbasket of Europe. Is the wheat price going to influence what a farmer does most? Is it weather, climate change, or is it something else? And multiple choice here, so you can have you can believe that it's one or two or three or four of these that influence farmers. Interesting that the consumer is staying top. That's good. There's a good split there, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, and it will change with over time and depending on where market forces are. Global geopolitics might not have come into the equation had there not been a war between Russia and Ukraine currently, but consumers is clearly coming out on top. And I'm going to move on. I think we've got a good enough spread. That's really interesting. So thank you, everybody. So I'm just going to come back to this slide again and say, it is a balancing act. You've proved the point by saying, there's an awful lot of players in the game here. Consumers are a huge part of it, directly and indirectly. And I suppose most of us are probably thinking directly about what we buy in the shop. And if we have more time, maybe in the Q&A, we can talk about what drives consumer choice, why you buy food. Is it for welfare? Is it for low carbon? Is it for low food miles? But agriculture policy is also dictated by people and politics. and the desire for cheap food and stable economies. And I think that's probably where I come from, and thinking that's the big driver currently. And one of the big pieces of evidence for this is if we look at wheat yields just as a proxy for farm outputs, this was steady for hundreds of years. This graph goes back to 1885, but if you go back 200 years more, this doesn't change much, 2 tons per hectare. And then all of a sudden you hit 1945, people realize, you know, that food security was an issue during the war, and so much is invested into food production efficiency and putting more fertilizer on, getting more food out of the ground. And then joining the EU and the CAP was the next kind of sea change in production. So you can see from 2 tons a hectare to 8 tons, 4 times the amount of production coming out of the ground. Good proxy for milk, whatever you want to talk about, but this is wheat. So good, you know, we're fed, food is cheap, we're not starving, we're secure. But that has an impact. And this is a graph of farmland birds. And you can see the blue line is general decline in farmland birds by 60%, only from the 70s to the mid 2015. So there's an argument this has been more severe. And there's a danger we don't appreciate this, because, you know, I was born in the late 70s, and at least that decline has happened in my lifetime. But children born 10 years ago will think this is just normal, that you've got lots of crows, lots of generalists, and not many specialists. And we've got a curlew here on the right, top right, that needs wet grassland, probes into mud for insects. So drained land has seen a huge reduction in the curlew. And then you've got the yellowhammer below it, which is a seed eater. So again, changes in arable, cleaner production, less weeds, even reduced arable. Northern Ireland doesn't do much arable, has seen reductions in yellowhammers in certain areas. So 2 very different species, both declining because of changes to agriculture in this time. You know, where is the balance? So we started at post-war, big for victory, production at all costs. We need to produce our own food, and that was the right policy option at that time. We're now in, thankfully, a much better place where we've got new schemes, new policies. The minister's announcing green farming schemes. We're paying farmers to put habitats back. We're looking post-Brexit and CAP. Can we make things better? CAP wasn't terrible, but there was an awful lot of bad things about it that with some autonomy, we can do much better. And DARA have come out with a policy proposal consultation. It closed about 2 weeks ago, and I'm pleased to say for the most part, it's really positive. Now, it's the biggest change since CAP. And what it's effectively doing, in a nutshell, we can talk in more detail. You can view our full consultation response on our website. But what it's proposing is that farmers get a reduced basic payment, which is the payment they currently get for farming. Yes, they have to comply with certain regulations and not pollute and whatever else, but that money is going to go to farming for nature, which is agri-environment measures. So farmers are going to be rewarded, excuse me, for producing biodiversity, carbon, multiple benefits instead of the single farm payment. So that's great. They're going to remove the penalty for ineligible land, and I'll cover that in the next slide, so I'll not dwell on it here. And there will be funding for carbon, more farmer peer-to-peer education, soil testing for efficiency and LIDAR, so that farms understand their carbon balance, their fertility balance, and don't use fertilizers where they shouldn't, don't plow carbon-rich fields where they shouldn't. So there's some really good points. A couple of kind of flies in the ointment. We're not sure what the headage proposal is all about. It's supposed to drive efficiency, and it will in a lowland farm. It may not have such good consequences in the uplands and marginal areas, but that's being refined as we speak. And there are no timelines or details for the implementation or the actual financial move from basic payment to farming for nature. So we're pushing for some more clarity on how that will happen and when that will happen. So just very quickly talk about land eligibility. This is the kind of map a farmer gets. All the purple bits, basically, they do not get paid for currently. So a farmer gets paid for every acre he has, unless it's deemed ineligible, which means not suitable for agriculture in the short term. So that includes a lot of habitats. So these are scrub, bits of raised bog, trees, and effectively this is a perverse incentive. So what has happened, this is why farmers cut hedges tight, take scrub out, burn heather, because it retains their land eligibility. So it's a perverse incentive. Farmer doesn't want to do it. They feel they have to do it to retain their single farm payment. This will be removed. This is fantastic. Farmers have no compulsion to remove these habitats. And to put that in context, we've got a corncrake top left, hugely in decline. It was great there were 4 calling birds in Rathlin last year. They love nettle beds, hogweed, scrubby corners of fields. That would benefit them. And then we've got a hen harrier nest bottom right. They love tall heather. So again, the areas that haven't been burnt for a long time, haven't been overmanaged, and they will nest more successfully too. So hopefully knock-on effects immediately from these kind of policy changes. And just flying the ointment, we're going the right way, but we have to remember all these policies, all these green policies are because we're in a time of peace and plenty, and we've got cheap food, and we've moved away from post-war rationale for ag policy. But the recent events cause you to think and wonder and hope that we can retain that, and that global geopolitics do play a part in ag policy. And I'd hate to think there's a day when we're plowing fields again and planting potatoes and cereals at the expense of biodiversity. But of course, we have to eat. Think back to that 3 circles on food security and food. It's a very, very narrow tightrope. So agri-environment schemes, this is how we deliver nature on farms. Excuse me. And in short, they're designed to enhance biodiversity, but also pay farmers to improve farm income. And this graph, don't worry about details, just to show that there's 3 types of farming here: dairy, less favoured areas, which are hill sheep and cattle, and lowlands, so more productive cattle and sheep farms. And the red line is the profit of agriculture, so doing agriculture. And in less favoured areas, which is most of Northern Ireland, farming isn't profitable. Full stop. It's difficult. And without support, single farm payment, agri-environment, you don't make money. Excuse me. So the green bar is agri-environment schemes. They basically offset farm losses in these kind of areas. And our role in our agri-environment role is to help these farmers improve the biodiversity on the farm through working with them, and also help them get in the schemes so that they can participate. Now, all is not rosy. Agri-environment schemes have been going from the early 90s. And the top bar, the light green, is Northern Ireland. Excuse me, just 1 second. I have a chesty cough. Northern Ireland has about 5% of the UK land mass. And the light green bar at the top is the amount of land in agri-environment in Northern Ireland across the years. And you can see through the mid-2000s, we were punching well above our weight. We had more than 5% of agri-environment land. That changed drastically from 2016 onwards. And that's due to a change in funding cycles and a change in schemes. That's disastrous. We're working on it. We're building it up. We don't want that to happen again. The history of agri-environment schemes in Northern Ireland started with the ESA scheme in the 80s, and then countryside management filled in all the blanks. So that the map on the right is ESA areas. Countryside management filled in all the grey areas, and now environmental farming scheme covers both, with the higher and wider. Higher being habitats, so we see rough ground and heather here, and wider being more conventional green fields, where farmers would be paid to put hedges back, plant trees, do buffer, cereal margins. Whereas the higher habitats, which is what Ulster Wildlife works on, is all about managing the habitat. So it'll be heather, species-rich grassland, those kind of things that require sensitive management and some professional advice. So our group, what is our group? Well, DARA started EFS back in 2017, and they started some groups as well, which as a pilot to work with farmers in certain areas, defined areas, to support them in signing up and understanding their scheme. There's currently 5 EFS groups. Ours started as West Fermanagh, which is really the most biodiverse area of Northern Ireland. But because we've been successful, we've spread further east, and we're now certainly the largest of the 5 groups. So we now have 411, excuse me, farmers across over 300 farm businesses. We're responsible for having delivered over 200 EFS agreements, and over 9,000 hectares of land is now managed thanks to our input with the farmers. So we're having a big influence across Northern Ireland. And group is fantastic for a number of reasons. I've slides after this. I'm going to fly through them because I've just recycled them from somewhere else. We don't have time tonight, so I'll dwell on this one. But basically, we help the department. We create more agreements for them. We knock doors to farmers and say, have you heard about this scheme? Come and sign up. We help the farmer understand what is a very complicated scheme of 100 pages, that they can get things wrong. They can be penalised. So we help them understand and make sure they're not penalised. We add value by teaching them about curlews and yellowhammers and hares, whatever it is, through talks and on-site visits. And we act as a conduit of information. So DARA tells us stuff, we spread it to the farmers. Farmers have issues, we have direct line to DARA. So we're constantly improving the scheme. And a really unintended consequence is social cohesion. So we're out with these farmers. They're meeting their neighbours, they're having a crack. And it's good for mental health, it's good for well-being, it's just good socially. Farming can be a very solitary pastime. And we're delivering across landscapes. So we talked about nature recovery networks, and we'll see how it works with marsh fertility in a minute. So I'll just skip through those. But these are some of the things: planting hedges, drain blocking on peatlands. We give feedback to farmers with a traffic light system on the scorecards here. Advice on habitat management, best practice. So this is rush topping, making green hay. Tell them what species they have on their farm. A lot of farmers will recognize the little yellow fella or whatever, but they'll not know its name necessarily. They'll not know why it's there, what it's good for. They love it when they know they've got orchids, or we'll talk about this blue flower on the right, devil's bit scabious, in a minute. It's really important they know what they are and why they're important. So carbon, very quickly, conscious of time. It's not necessarily all about biodiversity. I want to talk about carbon because it overlaps with biodiversity. It's complicated, it's very topical, and there's no easy answers to this. And certainly it's a big problem for the farming industry at the minute. One, to get their head around, and two, to understand how to deliver their share of carbon reductions. So in Northern Ireland, agriculture is responsible for over a quarter of emissions, and that is it's a real problem, but it's also a statistical problem, because unlike England, where agriculture is responsible for 8.4% of emissions, they have car factories and other heavy industry. So it actually means that their agriculture isn't worse per hectare, but they've got bigger polluters. But it puts agriculture in the spotlight in Northern Ireland as effectively our biggest industry. And we have to do our bit, regardless of the fact we're only 4% or 5% of UK land mass, 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions. We still have to do our bit as well. And the big problem for farming is methane. Because it's 28 times worse than carbon dioxide, and cows belch and fart methane, that is why farming is seen as a bigger problem than a transatlantic flight. Now, whether that's right or wrong remains to be seen, but that's how it's measured. So farming has a disproportionate impact on the measurements of climate change. And this is a problem for agriculture because we need to eat. Our land is good, it's grass, grass-based, so pasture is the best sustainable crop we can grow. What do we do about cattle? Do we reduce the numbers? We can make some more efficient, but do we do that outdoors or indoors? What does this do to our habitats, our rural communities? These are unanswered questions, and there will be huge change over the next 20, 30 years. And it was just reminding me of this book by Patrick Lowry, who is based in Dumfries in Galloway, and he keeps Galloway cattle on a traditional little hill farm, and he laments the change in landscape, the loss of the curlew, and his lifestyle is all about traditional farming. It's great for biodiversity. Is it good for carbon? Probably not. So what's the balance? And these are two great extremes, but which do we want our farming to be? Is it the one on the left that's really efficient? The emissions are captured, the animals are given feed additives to stop them emitting as much. You put lots of inputs in, it might be grain and soya, which comes from other countries, but is not measured against our carbon budget. It's high yielding, so it's efficient in one sense in terms of food production. There's minimal or no biodiversity in that model. Or do we want the one on the right, which is in Fermanagh, which is very inefficient? Cattle are just wandering around eating rough grass and not putting weight on quickly. but it's low input, low output. That's kind of efficient in a different way, but very carbon inefficient and full of biodiversity. There's no easy answer to this. But I have been struck by this. I've seen this in the last few days. You know, we're all fixated on carbon. It's really important. You know, without we don't want sea level changes. We don't want mass immigration. We don't want droughts. There would be no food anyway. But if we fixate on carbon, do we lose out on biodiversity and other things? We had to be careful to look at everything in the round. So peatlands, just that's the problem bit for farmers. This is the opportunity, because Northern Ireland is covered in peat, and most of it's farmed. It counts for 12% of our emissions through degraded drained bogs and various other issues. Forestry and things are included in there too. So there's an opportunity for farmers to do something here. So again, we work with farmers, peatland management. Grazing is, overgrazing will damage a bog, that's bad, but these habitats need managed and grazed. And again, agri-environment schemes deliver this. So this is an example of two kinds of pressure, you know. So this is a well-managed peat bog. The area in the foreground is slightly greener because that's where the sheep lie up, but that is a good quality blanket bog on Culca. And that farmer has been in agri-environment schemes for years, and his land has got better and better. He also happens to have the Culca boardwalk through his land, and that was built to prevent erosion through people damaging the bog through recreation. So, you know, that's a different pressure, but causes the same issues. So two different things being managed in that picture. And then vegetation does need managed. Burning is a very controversial thing, and we're all aware of improper burning of heathland, either maliciously or accidentally, but not managed. But managed burning is a tool. And what these guys are doing here, these are from the Mourne Heritage Trust, and they're teaching farmers how to create fire breaks. So they burn small sections of heather, which basically means if an accidental fire happens, it can't spread. So this is a training day. And similarly, that is my colleague Simon on the top left, demonstrating the RoboCut, which flails heather and rough grass, which creates patches for regeneration and biodiversity. So a farmer wouldn't have a RoboCut, but would have a flail on the back of a tractor that could do the same job. Simon has this tool for remote, inaccessible, steep places where you wouldn't get a tractor. And again, he's showing people how it can be done and the benefits of the habitat management. And again, these are all available through agri-environment schemes, and we work with farmers to deliver them. And then this is, again, colleagues of mine have done this. There's a great project called the CAN project, where they are spending a lot of money and a lot of time blocking old drains and bogs to re-wet them, to make the carbon, to make the bog active again, to grow sphagnum moss, to create peat. And the picture on the left is an aerial photo which shows the technique, which is where you take dig a hole, a borrow pit of peat, and you put it back in the drain to block it up. And you do these at regular intervals, depending on the drop in the land and various other things. It's more technical than it sounds. It takes a lot of hydrology and various other efforts, but it looks like it's been stitched back together. And I think that's a really nice analogy, that the land is being healed by being stitched up. So quickly, to tie it all together at the end, we've talked about protected species, habitat management, nature recovery networks, agri-environment, payments, grazing animals. Let's look at a quick example of how that works. So the marsh fritillary butterfly, it's a very iconic species. It's a Schedule 2 EU species, one of our most protected and important species in Northern Ireland. It's got a limited distribution. It's not common, but it's got a good population in the west around Fermanagh, and it's got patches around the Fens in County Down and various other places. But the thing to note is that these rings around each dot is a web or a breeding site. An adult will travel 10 kilometers, no more. So those are the rings. So there's a ring all around Fermanagh. That means you've got a population there. So that's good, but others are isolated, so they're in trouble. We need to join those up. How do we join those up? Well, the habitat has to be right. These butterflies need a particular plant called devil's bit scabious that they lay their eggs on, and the caterpillars eat the leaves. And this is the plant. It's beautiful. It's very late flowering, abundant in some meadows in Fermanagh and other parts of the world, but not common throughout the country at all. And again, one of the things we do, as I've said, is we teach farmers. So we teach them to identify these meadows And we also teach them that there are other species that they've got too that look similar. So they'll ring up and say, I've got devil's bit, but they might have something else. So again, education key. And then we're talking about a fragmented landscape. So it's kind of hard to see on this, but these patches of green are species-rich grassland in an area with marsh fritillary butterflies. So if you assume each of those patches is harboring marsh fritillary or has potential for it, they have to jump between them. You know, this was once a landscape full of species-rich habitat. It's been eaten away like this #2, and effectively we're at #3 now. We've got these little patches. So back to the nature recovery network concept, we want to make sure they're as good as they can be, and we want to expand them and around the edges, make sure these are protected. And we do that through agri-environment prescriptions. So if we find good species-rich grassland or all right species-rich grassland, we will encourage the farmer to join the scheme. He'll follow the prescription. Basically, he gets paid £180 a hectare per year to graze it in certain months in a certain way to benefit the habitat and the species. And effectively, what we're trying to get is this uneven structure at the top with lots of flowers, lots of bare bits. And the only way you can create that is by the optimum number of cattle. Sheep are no good for this. You need heavier hoof. And what we don't want is really tall, rank stuff. And what we don't want is overgrazed, really short stuff. And the reason you want this is because the marsh fritillary lays its eggs. The caterpillars go through various instars or stages, and every time they hatch as a caterpillar, they live together in a web, they eat the leaves, but they'll do this through the winter. They'll come out, so right now, end of February, start of March, they'll be out on a sunny day, and they need the sun, they need access to vegetation, but they also need bare patches to get the sun. And this picture on the right is one I took with an infrared camera in March last year. So the air temperature in the background was 13 degrees. These caterpillars were 36 degrees because they were managing to bask in the sun in just the right conditions. So this is key to their success. And it's actually quite hard to get right. So you go out in 2 farms. This is a great fence line study. This farm is trashed, too many horses. This is also trashed, no animals at all. And this bit is just right. You can see all the little tussocks. They are perfect. That's where the caterpillars will be. Whatever side the sun's hitting, they'll be on that tussock. And it's also important for regeneration. So that devil's bit scabious flowers, it sets seed. It takes 4 or 5 years for that seed to become a new plant. That seed needs to find bare ground, or it's won't compete in a dense thatch of grass. So these nice cattle hoof prints are creating niches for it. These are the seeds on a piece of dung. This is what they need. This is good heterogeneity in a landscape created by cattle. So that's us. Sum it up. I think that example shows, to come back to the 3 circles approach, that we're delivering food. So we didn't see the cattle in those pictures, but cattle were creating the niches. They're obviously a food item. They're creating sustainable beef. The farmer's happy. He's getting paid. We're talking to the farmer. He understands what he's supposed to do. He's proud of his land because he knows it's got value. And then why we're all here, for nature, we've protected one of the rarest and most important species in Northern Ireland, and we're protecting and enhancing loads of really, really important purple moorgrass, rush pasture, bits of bog. It's a win-win-win in this particular example. So just want to kind of see if you believe me, or there's lots of bad examples of land management, not just in farming, but overall, I want to know, do you think farming is currently delivering for nature? And that'll lead us in nicely to Q&A. I'm conscious we're a few minutes over, but we're not doing too bad. And then I need to remind you about the next talk that's coming up as well. So I'll do that after the poll. So the very last Slido poll, if you're still with us, if you're not asleep, I see lots of questions in the chat. I'll come back to Nina after the poll and after we talk about the next talk. So good even split at the start. So far, we have a very, very strong opinion that farming is not delivering for nature, and nobody has said it is, which is, I would definitely expect yes to be lower than no, but surprised that we're at 0. Not that I'm prompting anyone to say otherwise, because clearly there are lots of issues out there. If by magic somebody says yes, give it a couple of seconds. I don't think the demographics is going to change. I think we're clearly on there are issues with farming delivering for nature, which nobody can disagree with. Okay, we're not seeing any more change. That's pretty emphatic. So that's a good way to leave it and to start on the Q&A. Just Nina, if I can ask you to pick some questions and read them out to me, I'm just, if you want to start looking through them. And I just want to tell everybody that the next talk is on the 9th of March, at the same time, about Shark School, and that's hosted by Erin, our CD project officer. So obviously you've come here and you've registered. So if you're interested in that, do the same. And there are a few more talks after that. So the whole program will be on the website. And of course, most of your members, thank you for coming. There's also a good number of non-members who've paid to be here. That's fantastic. Don't forget, you can join. And the links to the website for either joining or volunteering are at the bottom of the page. So it'd be lovely for you to at least sign up to our Facebook page or whatever if you haven't already. I'm going to stop screen sharing now, and hopefully we'll get a few questions from Nina. And I can see lots of faces now too.
Hi, Peter. Yes, I've got a lovely spreadsheet going on here. I guess not necessarily an easy one, but quite, in my opinion, a nice landing to the questions. You know, in terms of, you know, what we can all do as individuals. We did the poll and kind of discovered that not many of us on the call are necessarily farmers. So what do you think that we could personally do? There was a question from Chris. You know, he owns a 3/4 acre of wet upland garden, which is sort of loosely turned to grass, although he says we are planting a traditional hedge. What do you think, you know, somebody like Chris could do, which is sort of, you could almost say farming at a very, very small scale?
Yeah, well, do you know what? I think scale is one of the issues. You take dairy farming, for example. In order to be profitable in dairy farming, you need to get bigger and bigger and more intensive, and it becomes more indoor and more about silage, and the biodiversity is lost. And that is because of the milk price and, you know, input prices and low profitability. We're all happy not paying much for milk, and that's what drives it. So anyway, I'm kind of slightly digressing, but the point is small traditional farms where people can, you know, earn a living from a few cattle and have rough edges of fields and nice hedges and manage the land in a sensitive way. That's really important. And it does worry me that farming will become bigger and bigger and more industrial to stay profitable because people expect cheap food. So just having a 1/4 acre or an acre, and, you know, planting a few trees in a hedge, growing a few vegetables, having some pollinator friendly strips. If everybody had that right through a landscape, we'd be winning. You know, that's what we need, landscape scale.
Yep, I like that word choice. Nature recovery networks all the way. I think the first question was from Patrick. And I guess moving on from, let's say, an individual garden, especially, I wonder if you could expand a little bit on kind of the sort of actions you could take as a more of an intensively managed or intensive kind of farming landscape. So Patrick there referred to, let's say, an arable landscape and thinking about species, you know, like lapwing or yellowhammer, you know, what would be the sort of actions that you would take, let's say, in an arable landscape in particular, which obviously is something that is not that common anymore in Northern Ireland.
Well,
for those species too.
I didn't cover that in detail because there was a whole lot to cover, and we deal in the West on marginal, you know, unimproved habitats, but there is an awful lot of biodiversity potential, particularly in the East, on arable and more intensive ground, and that's somewhere where probably the likes of RSPB do a lot of work because farmland birds are important. And there are options within EFS, and particularly in the wider side of the scheme, to plant or to leave strips, so unharvested strips, or to plant wild bird cover, which The best ones would be you leave them for 2 years and they'll have things like oats and triticale and quinoa, or quinoa. It's cheaper if you call it quinoa as a crop. It's very expensive if you call it quinoa and eat it. And things like even brassicas, full of spiders, insects, seeds, and they're fantastic for birds. Putting some hedges back, or if the machinery is too big, you could plant or leave a kind of beetle bank in the middle of a field, which allows the combine harvester to navigate around it. But you've basically created the same conditions as a hedgerow with weeds and wildflowers and a few scrubby bits. It's great for insects and good for the farm as well. So there are lots of things you can do on a more intensively farmed landscape, and all those options have been in schemes for a number of years. Lapwings were mentioned, so lapwings will breed on these kind of habitats, and if you're on Twitter, sometimes you'll see horrific pictures of saying, oh, there was a lapwing nest there the other day and it's gone now, it's been plowed. It's about education. A lot of farmers love these birds and would never do that if they knew, but there are payments for it, and it's important that the education part is there and that the scheme is there then to work with the farmer to make sure those areas are not plowed and they're left until the birds have fledged.
Excellent. That leads on quite well to Aileen's question, actually. She highlights completely correctly, the need of removing the perverse incentives as well, as much as we are trying to, create positive policy, but making sure, that there's no incentives for that, negative action. But going back to, heteros and the kind of changing of mindset and the need of education, she's asking, is there anything to encourage farmers who have already gotten rid of, the likes of heteros to reintroduce them? Kind of how would you approach that sort of a case?
Yeah. Well, there is. So again, through the current scheme, which is EFS, which will be Farming for Nature in a couple of years, you can get paid for putting hedges back, for planting trees, for leaving rough corners. But the challenge was with this land eligibility was if you planted a corner of trees, you would no longer have been eligible for your single farm payment. So it was conflicting. One hand, you were being told this is good and we'll pay you to do it, and on the other hand, you're being told, well, you're going to lose your subsidy for doing this as well. So the message is joined up now, and there were clear reasons for doing it. I keep talking and didn't talk about so much tonight, but unintended consequences. There's never been an agriculture policy that didn't have a clear rationale and a good reason for bringing it in at the time. But what has happened time and time again is that there's been an unintended consequence, which has generally been bad for biodiversity. And so even with this new suite of policies proposals, they seem on the face of it to be really good, and most are, and we're being cynical and test them, saying, well, what if? So yeah, we want to be careful about that.
Thanks. And I guess moving on to the kind of more wet elements, this was a question from Jenny. What might be some of the best ways a farmer can be encouraged to improve river water quality in Northern Ireland? What sort of actions could you take at a farm level for the waterways?
That's a really good one. So in current schemes, you can get a buffer strip option, either planted or unplanted. So the objective is to keep cattle out of the river or to stop slurry or other runoff hitting the river. In the new scheme, the proposal was quite exciting, is that they'll use LiDAR. So effectively, this is ground penetrating radar, which will show the slopes and various breakpoints and fields, which will allow fertilizers and manure to be applied, but in a really smart way, which will ensure it doesn't hit that river at all. So I think that's going to be a major win in the future.
Great, thanks a lot for that. Where do you then see, this is another question from Aileen, where do you see the kind of role of community farming, and do you see that as a sort of a viable option, especially it was scaled up a little?
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, but I do think we're starting to see a lot more urban farming and vertical farming and rooftop gardens, and when we're talking about carbon, ploughing land is not good for carbon emissions. This is one of those compromises we're going to have to make. So, growing potatoes is particularly bad for carbon emissions. Ploughing for wheat is bad. But somebody was talking in the talk earlier, which really struck me too. You're importing tomatoes or avocados from around the world. You're actually importing water, a lot of water from very, very water deprived areas. So to me, the more you can produce locally, particularly in gardens, rooftops, greenhouses, where you're not having an impact on carbon in the soil, you're offsetting damaging agriculture across the world. This is great. And we are seeing, also Wildlife is involved in West Belfast in some community gardening projects, and there is scope for producing quite a bit. And it's got the other benefits we talked about as well in terms of, local community and society, that feel good. So we don't talk much here about mental health, but that's a huge part of working together and the community aspect of farming. So yeah, fully endorse it and expect more and more to happen, particularly as food prices are likely to rise. The grow your own trend will continue, I think.
I can totally second that. I was very proud of my own little tomatoes last summer, I have to say, and goes back to kind of those little things that you can do as well at your own home, even if you live in an urban context, little actions and locally produced produce that doesn't cost you anything at all. And I think the kind of, as much as we talk about, big scale change and landscape scale, I think it's important to acknowledge, isn't it, that the kind of small actions that contribute towards, that bigger set of actions then. And just kind of,
and as I said, there's 25,000 farms in Northern Ireland. So what we want is them all to, if they all do a little bit, if they all keep their hedges, plant a bit and don't trim them so much, all of a sudden you have a huge change. You have more pollinators, more seeds for birds. They're the small action, large scale things that can really make a difference.
Yep. Actually, I just wanted to clarify that question I had from Patrick about the arable a little bit. Could you expand a little bit more on what Ulster Wildlife is doing specifically? Kind of, I guess we often talk about, cows and dairy farms, but it's especially, the kind of flora, native flora that you would find in an arable landscape. Could you expand a little bit more in terms of what is Ulster Wildlife doing specifically? Are we working in areas of arable land at all? And kind of
in EFS we're not, because we're focused on there are other groups that focus on wider schemes. We're focused very much in the West on semi-natural habitats, but our habitats team, or our species team, I should say, do work on those kind of habitats, because obviously barn owls are, as an example, are really dependent on arable landscapes and hedgerows and rough margins. So there's work goes on there. I'm a botanist by training, Patrick, so I do like rare and odd arable species, and they generally, but they're a ruderal, they like disturbance, they're effectively weeds. So just they're easier to retain than very sensitive species in wetlands and things. But I think the problem is we don't have traditional arable practices. We have more pesticides being used so that we have cleaner crops, cleaner ground. That's the challenge. And carbon, I keep coming back to carbon. It sounds like I don't like it. Of course we need to reduce our carbon, but ploughing for arable is a bad thing for carbon. So there could be more pressure on arable weeds and arable species in future. That's one of those areas we need to get the balance right.
Yeah, so would you say then a little bit more kind of attention to kind of understand kind of the kind of actions that would be the best in arable would be necessary, even if you're talking about sort of small scale that we have in terms of area. But do you think that there should be a little bit more kind of effort or focus even on arable with that in mind?
Yeah, I would love to do more in arable on the east. If we could expand. I mean, I think the new scheme, let's look to the future, will be more holistic. It very much, as I described in one of those slides, you're either in wider or you're in higher. And yeah, obviously most farms will have some habitat and some more intensive agriculture, but yet the two schemes are completely split in terms of who's responsible for them. It's interesting, so many questions are coming in about arable. I see another one flashed up there about species too. And it probably is an area we could do more on. As know, we do it on, on barn owls and other big species, but we haven't done the flora side at all. And maybe we're missing a trick. Maybe we need to look at that.
Yep, thanks. And an interesting one from Carol. Can you hire a man with a RoboCut to clear land for small woodland grant scheme?
I'm sure Simon's available at a price. I don't know. Actually, I don't think so. That piece of kit is assigned a particular project and is quite busy. I would love him. I have a meadow at home and I would love to cut it with it too because it's so steep. But and you'll not buy one in a hurry. I think they're about £50,000. But you're right. Site clearance and land prep requires a bit of expertise, and perhaps that's something somebody like the Woodland Trust or ourselves should invest in, this kind of land prep for the wide scale planting that's going to go on.
Thanks. It is a regular topic of conversation at the office. Everybody loves the RoboCut. I think we've got a couple of minutes left, and I think unless I've missed some questions, we've only got one more left, and quite a really interesting one. Talking about especially kind of carbon and the role of methane in the kind of meat and dairy production. What do you see, or do you envisage what they often get referred to as VAT grown meat ever making a kind of real major contribution environmentally?
I'd be wary about that. I'll go back to my unintended consequences, and hold my hands up. I drive an electric car, and I get green smugness from that. But I'm also very concerned about where the elements come from for the battery and how many electric cars can be made in the planet without causing problems and pollution elsewhere and potentially wars. And I don't know much about these synthetic or lab grown things, and intensive dairy, for example, is definitely a polluting industry. So there's no doubt other options are good, and the same with meat. But there is a place for real life, if you like. Obviously, people have got ethical issues, in terms of animal welfare and things. That's fine, but the animal production has a place and can be very sustainable done right in Northern Ireland. We have lots of water, not much sunlight, but the grass grows without fertilizer to a point, and probably a hill sheep is the most sustainable way of generating animal protein. You're effectively turning heather and grass and the sun into something you can eat. So we don't eat that locally. That's probably the most sustainable thing. I don't know if it's growing fungi or where these lab grown things are come from, but there'll be an environmental cost somewhere in the world. I don't know where or what about, but I'm cynical.
Fair enough. And I think we'll take this as the last question because we've just got 1 minute to go if we want to stick to time. There's one last question from Ethel. Is it feasible to try and sow scabious in a small area? So she's referring to a site of about 1 acre to help out marsh fruit.
Yeah, well, there's two answers to that question. One is yes, it's feasible to get the scabious to grow. So it likes wet. It's not fussy about acid or alkaline because it will grow on both. It doesn't like competition and it takes a while to germinate. So you could sprinkle seed, or you could buy plug plants from there's a couple of companies in County Down, Eco Seeds, and there's another one who worked with butterfly conservation to put plugs in. So yes, entirely feasible. Second part is to attract the marsh fritillary. Well, that's tricky because it depends where you are and how close the nearest colony is. It'd be fantastic to think you could, but why not? Because it's a beautiful flower and it's so late flowering. In fact, it's an interesting one. I love hay meadows. Fermanagh's got some good hay meadows. They're usually cut in July, but Devil's Bit scabious doesn't flower till August, September. So it's actually, you need a very late cut wherever you're putting it for it to thrive. So it doesn't work with hay meadows, interestingly.
Great stuff. Thanks a lot for that, Peter. It's coming to 8 o'clock now. Did you want to put up one last slide about the talk next week?
I'll put it back up, and I just see people are asking about copies of presentation. I should have said if I didn't already, it's been recorded. I'm not sure what happens if it's sent out or how that is
It's been
disseminated.
recorded on my computer, because I pressed record, but basically you should, once we obviously manage to upload it, you should be getting an email with the link to the recording, hopefully sooner than later, depending on how quickly I can pass on the recording from my laptop.
And there's just the final slide reminder, the next talk, which is next week, by Erin. So if you want to go to that, make sure and sign up as you did for this one. And say just a little plug again, if you're not a member, we'd be delighted if you joined. And there are lots of volunteering opportunities too. Nice and in person. Now we're getting out of COVID again, hopefully. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks for all the great
questions. Thank you for coming. Thanks for listening.